They tried to tow his truck over a stain, and 3 days later, he took half a man's porch with him without ever raising his voice. That's the kind of thing people around here still talk about, usually in low voices, like they're not quite sure if they should be impressed or a little afraid. And the truth is, if you weren't there, you'd probably think it was exaggerated, but I was there, and if anything, folks leave out the quiet parts, the parts that really mattered. This all happened on Alder Ridge Drive, one of those neighborhoods that looks friendly until you realize every mailbox is the exact same height and color, every lawn trimmed within an inch of its life, and every decision somehow runs through a handful of people who take that responsibility a little too seriously. You know the type, smiles at block parties, but clipboards in their cars. The man at the center of it all was named Walter Briggs. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, wore the same faded red flannel most mornings no matter the season, and drove this old, sun-bleached pickup that sounded like it had a cough it couldn't shake. Nothing flashy about him, nothing loud. He just existed in that steady, unbothered way that makes some people uneasy for reasons they can't explain. Walter had been there longer than most of us. His place wasn't big, wasn't polished, but it was his. And more importantly, he knew it. Every fence post, every crack in the driveway, every inch of that land. He knew where it began and where it ended without ever needing to check a document. Now across the street from him lived Daniel Mercer. Different kind of man entirely. Mid-40s, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be, even when he didn't. He'd been on the HOA board for years, 6 straight, if you asked him, and he made sure people knew it. His house looked like something out of a catalog, and 2 summers before all this, he'd built that wraparound porch that basically announced itself to the entire block. It was wide, polished wood, white railings, the kind of porch that didn't just sit there, it performed. People slowed down when they drove past. Some even stopped to ask who built it. Daniel loved that. What he didn't love was Walter's truck. Now, the truck wasn't doing anything wrong. It sat in Walter's driveway, always had. Yeah, there was an oil stain underneath it, dark and spread out like it had been there a long time, because it had. But it wasn't spilling into the street, wasn't bothering anyone except, apparently, Daniel. The first complaint showed up as a whisper at a neighborhood meeting. The second came as a friendly reminder. By the third, it wasn't friendly anymore. Then came Tuesday morning. I remember that morning clearly because I was out grabbing the paper when I saw Daniel standing across the street, arms crossed, just watching. Not talking, not moving, just waiting. And taped right onto Walter's mailbox was that notice. Crisp white paper, HOA letterhead at the top, and that ridiculous little gold crest they were so proud of. Walter came out a few minutes later, slow as ever, coffee mug in one hand. He saw the paper, didn't react right away, just stood there, reading. I couldn't hear every word, but I knew the tone. Vehicle deemed an eyesore. Oil stain in violation of community standards. And then the part that made a couple of us glance at each other from our yards. 48 hours. Tow enforcement pending. All for a truck that hadn't moved in years and wasn't even close to crossing his property line. Walter didn't storm off. Didn't crumple the paper. Didn't even look angry. He read it once, then folded it neatly, like it was a receipt he might need later, and slipped it into his flannel pocket. Then he looked up, not at Daniel, at the porch, and I swear, there was something in that look. Not frustration, not confusion, more like recognition. Like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. Daniel must have taken that silence as surrender because he called out, loud enough for half the block to hear. You've had plenty of warnings, Walter. This is just procedure now. Walter turned his head just slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Procedure, huh? That was it. No argument. No defense. He went back inside like nothing had happened. And I remember thinking, that didn't feel over. Not even close. Because some people yell when they're cornered, and some people get quiet. And the quiet ones, those are the ones you need to watch. The next morning, before most of us had even finished our first cup of coffee, a white county truck pulled up in front of Walter's place. And that's when things started to shift. That white truck didn't look like much at first. Just another county vehicle with a logo faded from too many summers. But the man who stepped out of it carried himself like someone who knew exactly why he was there, and more importantly, knew something the rest of us didn't. He introduced himself to Walter as Evan Cole, licensed surveyor, voice calm, professional, like this was just another Tuesday job. But there was a quiet sharpness in the way he looked at the property, like he was already mapping it out in his head before he even opened the back of his truck. Walter nodded once, like he'd been expecting him. No small talk, no explanation, just a simple morning. And then they got to work. By 8:15, Evan had his equipment set up near the edge of Walter's driveway, those tripod legs digging into the dirt like they'd done this 1,000 times before. By 9, he started placing the markers, thin rods first, then the bright orange flags, each one pushed into the ground with careful precision, like he was drawing a line no one else could see yet. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. Survey work happens. People check boundaries all the time. But then the line kept going. Across Walter's lawn straight, unwavering. And then it crossed the street. That's when people started paying attention. Mrs. Donnelly came out with her gardening gloves still on, pretending to check her roses while watching every move. A couple of teenagers slowed their bikes, whispering. I leaned against my mailbox, trying not to make it obvious I was just as curious as everyone else. And Daniel? Well, Daniel came out onto his porch. Of course he did. He stood there with that same posture he always had when he thought he was in control, shoulders back, arms loosely at his sides, like he was hosting the scene instead of being part of it. But you could tell something felt off. Because those orange flags? They weren't stopping at the curb. They weren't even slowing down. They kept going, right across his front yard. And then, they hit the porch. Not near it. Not along the edge. Through it. Right through the middle of that wide, polished showpiece of a structure. One flag went down just before the first step. Another, right between two support posts. And the third, landed squarely beyond it, completing a straight line like the porch had never even been considered an obstacle. You could feel the shift in the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the birds seemed quieter, like something bigger than all of us had just entered the scene. Daniel didn't move at first. Then he walked down those porch steps, slower than usual, like he was trying to stay composed while something underneath that composure was starting to crack. Hey, he called out, forcing a smile that didn't quite land. What exactly is going on here? Evan didn't look up right away. He adjusted one of his markers, checked a reading, scribbled something on his clipboard, then finally turned. Property survey, he said simply. Daniel let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they expect everyone else to laugh with them. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, why is it running through my porch? That's when Evan reached into his case and pulled out a folded document. Thick paper. Official. He handed it over without drama. County plat map, he said. You'll want to take a look at the easement line. Daniel took it, still smiling, but now the smile had edges. He glanced down, eyes scanning, and you could actually see the moment it hit him. Subtle, but real. His jaw tightened just enough, his shoulders pulled in just a fraction. That doesn't look right, he said, a little too quickly. Evan didn't argue. Didn't need to. It's recorded, he replied, tapping a section of the map. Filed with the county. Hasn't changed. Daniel shook his head, a short, dismissive motion. No, that's not possible. This porch was built 2 years ago. Fully approved. Approved by who? Evan asked, not confrontational, just precise. Daniel hesitated. And that hesitation, that was the first real crack. HOA, he said finally. Evan nodded once. HOA approval doesn't override county easements. Now people were stepping closer. Not crowding, but close enough to hear every word. You could feel it, that quiet pull when something ordinary turns into something nobody wants to miss. Daniel looked across the street then at Walter. And Walter was just standing there by his driveway, hands resting loosely at his sides, watching. Not smug, not angry, just present, like he'd already seen this moment play out in his head. You knew about this? Daniel called out, his voice sharper now. Walter tilted his head slightly. Knew about what? This. Daniel held up the map, shaking it once for emphasis. This easement. You had this done on purpose. Walter took a few slow steps forward, stopping just short of the line of flags. I had a survey done, he said. On my property. That line is wrong, Daniel snapped. There's no way that cuts through my structure. Evan stepped in, calm but firm. It's not wrong. 11 linear feet of your porch sits on that easement. 11 feet. Hearing it out loud made it real in a way the flags hadn't yet. Daniel let out a breath, short and sharp, like he'd just been punched in the ribs. That can't be right, he muttered again, but this time it sounded less like denial, and more like hope slipping. Walter reached into his pocket, then, slow, deliberate, and pulled out that folded notice from the day before. He looked at it for a second, almost like he was remembering something, then glanced back up. "My father signed that easement over," he said, voice steady. "Back in '71. County access. Never revoked. That landed differently. Because suddenly this wasn't just paperwork. This was history." Daniel's eyes flicked back to the map, then to the porch, then to Walter, like he was trying to find a version of reality where all three could still make sense together. "You're saying, what, this whole thing is illegal?" he asked, quieter now. Evan didn't soften it. "I'm saying it's an encroachment," he replied. "And it's not minor." Nobody said anything for a moment. The kind of silence that feels heavier than any argument. Then Daniel straightened up, trying to grab back some control. "Well, we'll review it," he said, voice tightening again. "I'll bring it to the board. We'll sort it out properly." Walter gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure you will." And there was something about the way he said it. Not mocking, not aggressive, just certain. Like the outcome had already been decided, and everyone else was just catching up. By that afternoon, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. By evening, people were walking past Daniel's house slower than usual, glancing at the porch like it had suddenly become something fragile. And by the end of the week, the HOA sent out another notice. But this one wasn't taped to a mailbox, and it wasn't addressed to Walter. By Friday afternoon, the tone had changed. You could feel it before you even saw the paper. It wasn't taped up for everyone to see this time. No gold crest proudly displayed for the neighborhood to admire. This one was delivered quietly, slipped into Daniel's mailbox like something that didn't want attention, even though, by then, attention was already everywhere. Still, word got out. It always does. Mandatory removal. That was the phrase people kept repeating. Not review. Not appeal. Not a discussion at the next HOA meeting with polite nods and carefully worded disagreements. Just removal. And for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mercer didn't come outside that evening. No pacing on the porch, no phone calls taken out in the open like he usually did, no subtle attempts to control the narrative. His house stayed quiet, lights on, but no movement behind the windows. Saturday morning came in cold, the kind of dry, sharp cold that makes sound travel farther than it should. I stepped outside a little before 8 and already saw the truck parked in front of his place, not a county truck this time, but a demolition crew. 2 men in heavy jackets were unloading tools, moving with that efficient rhythm that says they've done this before and don't need to talk about it. And then the neighbors started drifting out. Nobody announced it. Nobody said, "Hey, let's all go watch." But one by one, people found reasons to be outside. Coffee cups in hand, leashes with dogs that didn't need walking, garden tools that weren't actually being used. We all knew what was about to happen, and we all wanted to see it. Daniel finally came out just as the crew was setting up. No blazer today, no polished shoes, just jeans and a jacket, hair slightly out of place. And for the first time, he looked like someone who didn't quite know where to stand. He spoke briefly with the foreman, voice low, controlled, but even from across the street, you could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands kept shifting like he couldn't get comfortable in his own skin. Then the first board came off. It wasn't dramatic. No crash, no big moment. Just the sound of wood being pried loose, a dull, cracking pop that echoed more than it should have in the quiet morning air. And something about that sound, it changed the mood. Because that porch, the one that had looked so permanent, so solid, so proud, suddenly didn't. Piece by piece, it started coming apart. Railings first, then sections of flooring. Each removal exposing the structure underneath. Beams, supports, the parts nobody ever really thinks about when they're admiring something from the outside. Daniel stood off to the side, arms folded tight now, not in authority like before, but like he was holding something in. At one point, he glanced across the street. Walter was there, of course, standing near his driveway. Same flannel, same posture, hands resting easy, like he was watching the weather change. Their eyes met for a second, and this time, Daniel walked over. The crowd didn't move, but you could feel everyone leaning in, just a little, like the whole block was holding its breath. Daniel stopped a few feet from Walter, not too close, not too far. "You could have just talked to me," he said, voice lower than usual, stripped of that edge it used to carry. "We could have worked something out." Walter didn't answer right away. He looked past Daniel for a second at the porch, or what was left of it, then back at him. "I got a notice," Walter said simply. Daniel exhaled, a hint of frustration creeping back in. "That's procedure, you know that." It wasn't personal. Walter tilted his head slightly. "Didn't feel like procedure. It was about standards," Daniel replied, a little sharper now, like he was trying to rebuild something that had already fallen apart. "We've got rules for a reason. You let things slide, the whole neighborhood starts." "Starts what?" Walter cut in, not loud, not aggressive, just precise. Daniel stopped, and for a second, he didn't have an answer. Walter reached into his pocket again, pulling out that same folded notice, edges a little more worn now. "You said my truck was hurting the neighborhood," he continued, holding the paper loosely. "Said it didn't belong." Daniel looked at it, then away. "It was out of compliance." Walter nodded once. "Funny thing about that." He gestured lightly toward the porch. "So was that." No sarcasm, no smile, just truth, laid out plain. Daniel's jaw tightened, but there wasn't much left to say. Because the difference between them, in that moment, wasn't just about a truck or a porch. It was about who understood the ground they were standing on. They stood there a second longer, the noise of the dismantling porch filling the space between them. Then Daniel turned and walked back without another word. By midday, the structure was barely recognizable. By late afternoon, it was gone. All that was left was an open stretch of front yard and a faint outline where something used to stand. It looked smaller than it had before. Or maybe everything else just felt bigger. The following week, Daniel resigned from the HOA board. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet update in the community bulletin that most people read twice to make sure they hadn't misunderstood. Some said it was embarrassment. Some said it was pressure. A few said it was overdue. Walter's truck? Still there. Same spot. Same stain underneath it. No tow truck ever came. And if you ask me, that's the part people get wrong when they tell this story. They focus on the porch coming down, on the gotcha moment, on the idea that Walter somehow won. But that's not really what it was. Because Walter didn't celebrate. Didn't tell anyone, "I told you so." Didn't even bring it up again. He just went back to his routine. Mornings with his coffee, quiet afternoons, that old truck sitting where it always had. Like nothing needed to be proven. And maybe that's the point. You can enforce every rule you want. Write them, print them, tape them up with official seals and fancy crests. But rules don't mean much if you don't understand the ground they're standing on. And sometimes, the ground remembers things people forget. Now here's what I'm curious about. Was Walter justified in what he did, or did he take it too far? Was Daniel just doing his job, or was it never really about the rules in the first place? Because depending on how you look at it, this wasn't just about a truck or a porch. It was about control, about respect, about knowing where your authority ends and where someone else's begins. So I want to hear from you. Who do you think was right? And more importantly, what would you have done if you were standing on that street, watching it all unfold?